a glass of water, a slice of bread, and a seat in first class. What could possibly go wrong? Malcolm Reed boarded Flight UA1428 as a tech executive. By the time the plane landed, he was a symbol of something far greater, a reckoning that would shake the airline industry to its core. But how does a man worth millions, a man used to boardrooms, investors, and innovation, end up humiliated 30,000 feet in the air with nothing on his tray but stale bread and a plastic cup of water? And more importantly, why did no one stop it? Why did flight attendants overlook him? Why did other passengers whisper, mock, and assume he didn't belong? Why did a seasoned captain, fully aware of his presence, choose silence instead of action? Is it possible that decades of quiet bias, unchecked authority, and corporate apathy all collided on one flight? And what happens when the man you mistreat turns out to own your future? This isn't a story about airline food. It's a story about power, perception, and dignity. About a man who didn't shout, didn't threaten, but documented, waited, and let the truth rise to the surface. In just a few hours, everything changed from one tray of bread and water to an industry-wide transformation. But this story isn't just about Malcolm. It's about all of us. How we see people, how we judge, how we stay silent or choose to speak up. So ask yourself, what would you have done on that flight? Would you have noticed? Would you have intervened? Would you have cared if it wasn't your seat, your tray, your dignity on the line? Because maybe, just maybe, the seat that starts a revolution doesn't need to be in the cockpit. It just needs someone brave enough to sit in it. If you believe stories like this matter, like, share, and subscribe for more real-life narratives that challenge how we see the world and each other. Let's step on board. The story begins now. Nobody expected a slice of dry bread and a cup of lukewarm water to ignite a corporate revolution. But when Malcolm Reed boarded his first-class flight to Chicago that morning, he wasn't just flying to close a merger. He was stepping into a moment that would force an entire industry to reckon with itself. As the flight attendant placed the meager tray in front of him with a cutting sneer, "This meal fits you," the cabin grew stiff with discomfort. But by sunrise, the tech CEO she had just humiliated wouldn't merely hold a ticket on her flight. He'd hold the power to change the future of the airline she worked for. Some revolutions begin with fire. This one started with bread. But let's rewind. Before the plane, before the power, before the policy shift, there was just an early morning, soft light filtering into a quiet bedroom in a quiet suburb, and a man packing a suitcase. Malcolm Reed zipped up his carry-on with the precision of someone who'd traveled more miles than he could count. At 39, he had his routine dialed-in passport, wallet, external battery, backup battery, contracts in hard copy, digital backups in the cloud. On the edge of the bed, Jasmine Reed, his wife of 11 years, watched him with a mix of pride and the ever-present concern of someone who knew just how heavy her husband's world could be. "You sure you have everything?" Jasmine Reed asked, gently folding down the collar of his favorite jacket. "I've got everything that matters," Malcolm Reed replied, his voice calm but charged with quiet focus. Just then, a burst of energy exploded into the room. Bare feet pattering, curly hair bouncing, 8-year-old Nia Reed, still in her Wonder Woman pajamas, launched herself into her father's arms. "Do you really have to go?" Daddy Malcolm Reed crouched down to meet her eyes, brushing a rogue curl from her forehead. "Just for a few days, baby girl," he said softly. "And when I come back, things will be different. Different like better." A smile stretched across his face. "Yeah, Much better. Jasmine Reed glanced at her watch. Car should be here any minute. Right on cue. Malcolm Reed's phone buzzed with a message. Limo's here? He confirmed. He hugged Nia Reed tightly one more time, kissed Jasmine Reed gently on the cheek, and headed for the front door. Through the window, he could see the sleek black car idling at the curb, the driver already holding the door open. As he reached for the doorknob, his phone rang. He answered without hesitation. Morning, Tasha Green. Good morning, Mr. Reed. His assistant of 3 years responded crisply. Just confirming your destination. The merger meeting will be held at the Silver Line Hotel in downtown Chicago. Penthouse Boardroom, 9A, Mem, tomorrow. All board members have confirmed. Perfect, Malcolm Reed replied. Make sure legal sends the revised clauses to my secure email before we land. They're already waiting in your inbox. Safe travels, sir. He ended the call and stepped outside. The air held the first cool whispers of autumn, a welcome shift from the summer's heavy heat. Good morning, Mr. Reed, the driver greeted. O'Hare International. Terminal 4. That's right, Martin. The driver placed the suitcase in the trunk as Malcolm Reed slid into the plush interior. He didn't need music or distractions. He was already rehearsing tomorrow's pitch in his mind, the climax of months of negotiation, strategic misdirection, and quiet ambition. Suburbia drifted past the window-manicured lawns, identical shutters, quiet perfection. After tomorrow's meeting, Malcolm Reed's place in that world would be unshakable. Every piece was moving into place. 40 minutes later, the car pulled up to the bustling departure zone of O'Hare International Airport. Malcolm Reed had swapped his tailored jacket for a soft gray hoodie, crisp designer jeans, and limited edition sneakers. It was a calculated choice. In boardrooms, he wore power like armor, but while traveling, he dressed like the underestimated because it still worked to his advantage. The terminal buzzed with energy, the chorus of rolling suitcases, overhead announcements, clinking coffee cups. Malcolm Reed made his way to the first-class check-in desk, walking with quiet purpose. The desk agent, a woman in her early 50s with sharp eyes and a too-practiced smile, had just finished assisting a suited passenger. She glanced up at Malcolm Reed, scanning his hoodie and sneakers. Her smile faltered. Good morning, Malcolm Reed greeted politely, placing his ID and platinum status card on the counter. Her eyes flicked down, then back up. Coach check-in is down there, she said, gesturing toward a longer line. I'm flying first class, Malcolm Reed replied evenly. Her expression twitched. She looked back at his documents, suddenly more careful now, her fingers dancing across the keyboard as if searching for a reason to deny him. After a long pause, she finally murmured, You're confirmed. Gate 43. Boarding in 45 minutes. He accepted his boarding pass with a thank you, his tone gracious. As he walked away, he caught the flicker in her eyes, the barely hidden disbelief. It lasted less than a second. But he saw it. He always saw it. Further down the terminal, he passed a customer service desk where 2 agents offered sparkling wine and lounge access to a group of men in tailored suits. One of the agents looked at Malcolm Reed as he passed, platinum tag swinging from his luggage handle, but said nothing. He didn't stop. He didn't need champagne. Not today. As he approached security, Malcolm Reed noticed an older man struggling with a suitcase too large for his frame. The man grunted, attempting to heave it onto the conveyor belt. Without a word, Malcolm Reed stepped forward. Here, let me get that for you. The older gentleman blinked. His hair was snow white, his suit impeccably pressed. Thank you, young man. No problem. As Malcolm Reed stepped through the metal detector, he caught a glance from a couple nearby. The woman leaned in and whispered something to her partner. They looked at him again, not with hostility, but with presumption. They thought he was staff. It was always the same formula: hoodie, sneakers, skin, and assumption. At Gate 43, the waiting area was already alive with the quiet buzz of business travelers and early risers. Malcolm Reed found a corner seat and pulled out his tablet. Contracts, strategy, notes. There was work to do. But soon, the real work would begin. The gate agent's voice rang out crisply over the intercom, signaling the beginning of boarding for first class and platinum members. Without hesitation, Malcolm Reed rose from his seat, collected his tablet and carry-on, and made his way to the front of the line. He felt the weight of eyes as he walked, the familiar scrutiny he had learned to expect in certain spaces. As he approached the jet bridge, a voice floated from behind him low, but unmistakably intended to reach him. Guess they'll let anyone up front these days. Malcolm Reed didn't turn. He didn't need to. The barb was tired, predictable, and unworthy of his energy. Tomorrow's merger demanded his attention, not someone else's ignorance. On board. Malcolm Reed found his seat 2A, a spacious window spot in the first row of first class. He placed his carry-on in the overhead bin, sat down, and began powering on his tablet, immediately immersing himself in his final review notes. The cabin was still quiet. A few passengers beginning to trickle in behind him. A flight attendant moved efficiently down the aisle, offering pre-flight drinks with a polished rhythm. Her name tag read, Marissa Clark. Her hair was neat, her posture confident. But the moment her eyes landed on Malcolm Reed, something shifted. Her smile flickered and faltered. She paused mid-step, then leaned toward her fellow attendant, a tall man with blonde hair and a guarded expression, and whispered something too low for most to hear. But Malcolm Reed heard it clearly. He's in the wrong cabin. The male attendant, Ethan Lowe, glanced toward Malcolm but said nothing. His face was unreadable as he resumed arranging glassware. Malcolm Reed kept his focus on his tablet, but mentally bookmarked the moment. Another tick on a long mental ledger of coded behaviors and whispered judgments. He had spent decades in boardrooms where smiles concealed disdain and handshakes felt more like tests. This was nothing new. Outside the window, ground crew moved with mechanical precision beneath the morning sun, loading carts and checking gauges. In less than 24 hours, Nova Flight Systems would finalize its acquisition of the airline. What he was witnessing wasn't just personal. It was data valuable, revealing, and necessary. The cabin filled quickly. Business travelers murmuring into phones, flipping through reports, adjusting their seats. Malcolm Reed remained focused on his tablet until a shadow moved across his tray table. "Sir, this section is for first-class passengers only," came Marissa Clark's voice, sweetened with forced professionalism, but her eyes cold with skepticism. Malcolm Reed looked up slowly, his expression unreadable. Without a word, he reached into his hoodie pocket and handed her his boarding pass. She inspected it with exaggerated scrutiny, her eyes darting between the ticket and his face. Then, with a humorless chuckle, she returned it. "I see," she said, the words heavy with something bitter beneath the surface. She turned and walked away. No apology, no acknowledgement of the assumption. Malcolm Reed caught Ethan Lowe watching from the galley. The man quickly turned away, busying himself with offering orange juice to another passenger, a white man in a crisp blazer. As more passengers boarded, Malcolm Reed noticed curious glances and hushed whispers. Two women in sleek business attire passed by, casting sideways glances. One leaned toward the other and murmured, Security detail. Or maybe he hit the lottery. They made no effort to lower their voices. Malcolm Reed continued reviewing his boardroom pitch, untouched by the commentary. There were final clauses to revise, contingencies to anticipate. The merger between Nova Flight Systems and the airline was nearly complete, but it wasn't just a corporate move. It was a strategic insertion into the heart of an industry he had every intention of changing. Across the aisle. Marissa Clark continued her pre-flight service, offering warm towels and champagne. Each time she passed Malcolm Reed's row, she skipped him with the practiced ease of someone who wanted it to look unintentional. But it wasn't, and it wasn't missed. These weren't dramatic offenses. They were quiet omissions, silent verdicts rendered without due process. Still, the sting was real. A few minutes before the door closed, the last first-class passenger boarded a young white woman in her early 30s, casually dressed, her blonde hair tied back in a ponytail. She took the seat across the aisle from Malcolm Reed with practiced confidence. Instantly, Marissa Clark approached her with a glowing smile. "Welcome aboard, miss. May I offer you champagne or orange juice before takeoff?" "Champagne would be lovely," the woman said, returning the warmth. "Would you care for some warm nuts or a fruit plate?" "Nuts, please." Marissa Clark returned moments later with a sparkling glass and a delicate porcelain dish. "Here you are. Let me know if there's anything else at all." Malcolm Reed glanced across the aisle. The contrast wasn't subtle, and it wasn't lost on the woman, either. Her gaze flicked from her tray to Marissa Clark, then to Malcolm, her brow faintly furrowing. The plane pushed back from the gate, the captain's voice drifting over the intercom, welcoming passengers to the flight to Chicago. As the safety demonstration began, Malcolm Reed stored his tablet and adjusted his seatbelt. Once airborne, the in-flight service began. Marissa Clark glided down the aisle with a polished cart, warm towels, gourmet menus. She offered each passenger full attention except for Malcolm Reed. Again, she passed his row without pause, moving on as if he were part of the seat. Then, without warning, she returned with a tray. There was no elegance in her approach, no finesse. On the tray sat a single sad slice of dry bread and a clear plastic cup of water. She set it down in front of him with a half smile, the kind that carried more bite than politeness. "This meal fits you," she said. The words sliced through the cabin. The woman across the aisle straightened in her seat. A man one row ahead flinched, letting out a nervous chuckle before turning forward again, pretending he hadn't heard. Malcolm Reed stared at the tray, then slowly looked up at Marissa Clark, his expression cool and measured. "Is this the standard first-class meal?" he asked, his voice even, without a hint of anger. "We ran out of options," she replied with a careless shrug. It was a lie, and not even a clever one. She hadn't asked for his preference, hadn't offered him a menu, hadn't so much as glanced at the catering list. Across the aisle, the young woman's voice rang out clearly. "Excuse me." Marissa Clark turned, her expression instantly reverting to customer service mode. "Yes. Miss, could I see the menu?" "Of course," she said, retrieving a card with practiced ease and handing it over. The woman scanned the selections, then looked back at Marissa Clark with disbelief. "Why didn't he get one?" she asked, nodding toward Malcolm Reed. The smile on Marissa Clark's face tightened. "Some passengers don't seem interested in fine dining," she replied coolly. Silence fell again, heavier this time. The air seemed denser, the unspoken more deafening. Malcolm Reed said nothing. Instead, he reached for his phone, snapped a photo of the plate, then angled his camera discreetly to capture Marissa Clark's name badge. "Photography of crew is discouraged," she muttered. He didn't reply. He opened his messaging app and attached the images to a brief message addressed to Tasha Green. "Begin monitoring this flight." He hit send. Across the aisle. The young woman leaned toward him. I can't believe she said that," she whispered. "That was completely inappropriate." Malcolm Reed offered her a small nod of thanks. "I'm Malcolm Reed," he said quietly. She extended her hand. "Sophie Lang." "And that was disgusting." He nodded again. "Thank you for noticing," as Marissa Clark returned with a full entree for another passenger. Sophie Lang couldn't help but glance at the untouched bread and water across from her and the man quietly collecting proof of what would soon be undeniable. "Can I help you?" Marissa Clark asked with a polished tone as she turned to face the woman seated across from Malcolm Reed. "Yes." "Could I see the menu?" "Please," the woman asked, calm but pointed. "Of course." Marissa Clark retrieved a leather-bound menu card from the service station and handed it over with a tight smile. The woman flipped through the options, her eyes scanning the gourmet selections. Then she looked up, her expression shifting. "Why didn't he receive one?" she asked, gesturing discreetly toward Malcolm Reed. The flight attendant's smile thinned, the edges sharpening into something defensive. "Some people don't seem like they'd care for fine dining," she replied coolly, the implication sharp and unmistakable. The woman's eyes widened slightly, not just in disbelief, but in recognition. She had seen enough to understand what was happening. Before she could say more, Malcolm Reed quietly lifted his phone. Without ceremony, he opened his camera, took a clear photo of the dry bread and water tray, then slowly angled the lens toward Marissa Clark's name badge. Her face flickered uncertainty slipping through her polished demeanor for just a moment. "Photography of crew members is discouraged," she said stiffly. He didn't respond. Instead, he switched apps and typed a simple message to Tasha Green, attaching the photos. "Make sure you're watching this flight." He hit send. She would know exactly what to do. This wasn't his first time documenting treatment like this, but it was the most flagrant he'd experienced in years. Deliberate, public, calculated. As Marissa Clark moved on, Sophie Lang, the woman across the aisle, leaned in slightly. "I can't believe what just happened," she whispered. "That was completely inappropriate." Malcolm Reed gave her a quiet nod of thanks. "Thank you for noticing. I'm Sophie Lang," she offered, extending her hand. "Malcolm Reed," he replied, shaking hers. Her grip was firm, her eyes sharp. She looked like she wanted to say more. But just then, Marissa Clark returned to Sophie's row with a tray carefully arranged with filet mignon, roasted vegetables, and a glass of red wine. "Your meal." "Miss," she said brightly. "Can I get you anything else?" Sophie Lang accepted the tray but looked directly at her. "Actually, yes. I'd like to know why this gentleman hasn't been offered the same options as everyone else." Marissa Clark's smile faltered. "As I mentioned, we've run out of some options." Sophie Lang's brow lifted. "Really? Because I just watched you serve that exact meal to someone 3 rows back." There was no comeback, just a faint flush on Marissa Clark's cheeks and a clipped, "I'll check if there's anything available," before she turned and walked away. Sophie Lang looked back at Malcolm Reed, her expression apologetic. "I'm sorry you're dealing with this. It's not unusual," he said, voice low, but this time it's being documented. She nodded slowly. "Good." His phone buzzed again. A new message from Tasha Green. Received. Security teams are monitoring. He slid the phone back into his pocket, a mix of emotions bubbling just beneath the surface. He had endured many slights, many subtle humiliations. But this time was different, because this time he was in position to change the rules. By the time the plane touched down in Chicago, Malcolm Reed wouldn't just be a mistreated passenger. He'd be a key stakeholder in the company that employed these flight attendants. The balance of power was shifting. The flight continued. But Marissa Clark made no effort to correct her behavior. She moved through the cabin with effortless grace, offering wines, meals, and smiles to every passenger except one. She didn't glance at Malcolm Reed again, didn't acknowledge his presence. Ethan Lowe, the male flight attendant who had heard everything, seemed more uncomfortable now. He cast occasional glances toward Malcolm, his face strained with an awareness he hadn't possessed earlier. But still, he said nothing. He served others and left Malcolm's row untouched. The tray with bread and water remained in front of Malcolm Reed, a silent monument to the discrimination unfolding in the open. He noticed other passengers occasionally looking at the untouched meal. Some looked confused, others concerned, but nearly all quickly looked away when they realized he had seen them. Only Sophie Lang refused to pretend. She ate her meal slowly, eyes flicking between her food and the injustice across from her. Her expression moved from discomfort to quiet fury. When Marissa Clark returned to collect Sophie's empty plate, Sophie made sure her voice carried, "Has the gentleman across from me been offered a proper meal?" Yet Marissa Clark's smile stretched, brittle and forced. "I'll check again," she said, tone clipped. She wouldn't, and they both knew it. A few minutes later, Malcolm Reed's phone vibrated again. This time, the message came from someone else on his executive team. All systems monitoring Flight UA1428. Video feeds accessed, documentation ongoing. A slight smile crept across Malcolm Reed's face. Every glance, every word, every omission, it was all being logged. By the time he stepped off this flight, a full record would exist. Outside the window, clouds stretched endlessly beneath them, white and pristine, a stark contrast to the rot inside the cabin. He remembered his daughter's words from that morning. Will it be better? He had promised it would be. For her, for himself, for everyone who'd ever had to sit quietly and pretend they didn't notice. Yes, it would be better. Sophie Lang watched the cabin crew continue their orchestrated service meals plated with care, wine glasses polished, napkins folded, seared salmon, fresh asparagus, clinking silverware, and across from her, Malcolm Reed's tray, a lone slice of dry bread, water in a flimsy plastic cup. The contrast was painful. Marissa Clark moved with confident precision, but each time she passed Malcolm Reed, she skipped his row without hesitation. Ethan Lowe followed her lead, avoiding eye contact, pretending not to see. Sophie Lang leaned across the aisle once more. "I saw what happened," she whispered. "That wasn't right. Are you okay?" "I've seen worse," Malcolm Reed said quietly. "But this time it's being recorded." A man in the row ahead shifted in his seat, clearly listening. He turned slightly silver-haired, dressed in a deep navy suit with gold cufflinks that gleamed in the cabin lights. He regarded Malcolm Reed with curious calculation. "Excuse me," the man said, his tone, the smooth confidence of old money. "Couldn't help but overhear. What do you do, young man?" The question dripped with assumptions, spoken like someone who needed Malcolm Reed to justify his presence in this cabin. Malcolm Reed looked at him without flinching. "I run a technology firm," he said plainly. The man arched an eyebrow. "A startup." A bit more than that. The man smiled, indulgent. Well, I'm Warren Tully, Finance, Northgate Capital. Perhaps we'll cross paths. He extended a hand. Malcolm Reed glanced at it, then back at the man's face. After a beat, he shook it firmly, without warmth. The man nodded, satisfied, and turned back to his cocktail. Sophie Lang watched the exchange with interest. "He doesn't get it," she murmured. "He doesn't need to." Malcolm Reed replied, "Not yet." His phone buzzed again. All activity logged. Audio, video, timestamps complete. Waiting on your instruction. He placed the phone face down on his tray. The bread and water still sat beside it, untouched. By the end of this flight, they would mean far more than a missed meal. They would become the symbol of something broken and the start of something better. Malcolm Reed recognized the type immediately, the tone, the body language, the carefully concealed arrogance. Warren Tully didn't need to wear a name badge to telegraph who he was old money, likely East Coast, someone who had rarely, if ever, shared space like this with a black man who wasn't pouring drinks or piloting luggage. "I run a small tech company," Malcolm answered simply. Not defensive, not boastful, just enough. Warren Tully raised an eyebrow. "Oh, startups. Cute." He chuckled softly, sipping his scotch as though he were patting Malcolm on the head from across the aisle. "I'm Warren Tully. Banking," he added, as if that settled everything. "Malcolm Reed," came the reply, cool and measured. He didn't elaborate. Let Tully make his assumptions. Most people like him were more comfortable with fiction than truth. Tully turned back to his drink, visibly satisfied, having dropped Malcolm into a box labeled insignificant. But the smugness didn't linger long. From the galley, the sound of muffled voices carried into the cabin. Laughter, hushed tones, just not hushed enough. Coach Guy is still waiting for a real meal. Someone said, "More laughter, probably expected fried chicken." Another voice added, the sneer and the stereotype slicing through the air like a knife. Malcolm's jaw clenched, just for a second. Then he inhaled quietly and pressed the record button on his phone. Every word, every slur, every insult, they were all being collected, logged, preserved. His phone vibrated again. A new message from Tasha Green security teams are in place at O'Hare. "Everything going as planned," Malcolm typed back with steady fingers. "Better than expected. They're writing their own downfall." The message tone pinged softly. That was enough to draw Marissa Clark's attention. She glanced at the glowing screen in his hand. "Sir, I need you to put your phone in airplane mode for security compliance," she said. Her voice suddenly laced with authority she hadn't displayed earlier. "It's in airplane mode," Malcolm Reed replied. "Calm and direct. I'm reviewing documents. I'll need to verify that," she said, extending her hand. Malcolm didn't flinch. "That's not within your authority," he said, eyes locked on hers. FAA regulations allow personal device use in airplane mode. Airline personnel don't have jurisdiction over private property without cause. I'm very familiar with privacy law." Marissa's lips thinned. She withdrew her hand slowly, stung by the pushback. As she turned away, she muttered something under her breath, not quite quiet enough. His recording app caught every word. Minutes later, Ethan Lowe approached his seat, his expression strangely apologetic. He leaned down slightly, speaking just above a whisper. "Sorry about earlier," he said, glancing over his shoulder. She gets territorial with certain passengers." The way he said certain told Malcolm everything he needed to know. The apology was limp, Not real accountability, a professional dodge rather than a stand. You still serve next to her, Malcolm Reed said evenly. That's all I need to know. The words landed with a sharp thud. Ethan Lowe's face reddened. He straightened quickly and retreated to the galley, visibly shaken. Across the aisle, Sophie Lang had watched the interaction unfold. She offered Malcolm a small nod of approval. "Bystanders," she murmured. "Sometimes they're worse than the instigators." "They're certainly more common," he replied quietly. The intercom cracked to life. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain, Richard Nolan. We're cruising at 36,000 feet with clear skies ahead. Estimated arrival at O'Hare remains on schedule. Weather in Chicago is partly cloudy at 68 degrees. We'll begin our descent in about 40 minutes. Until then, sit back and enjoy the rest of your flight." Malcolm frowned, his gaze tightening. Captain Richard Nolan, a name he knew all too well. When the anonymous audit flights were planned, Malcolm had explicitly requested that Nolan be excluded from piloting this one. Nolan had been flagged for previous conduct unaddressed, undocumented, and yet, here he was. The presence of Captain Nolan was no coincidence. It was sabotage or negligence. Either was unacceptable. His phone buzzed again. Captain ID confirmed Nolan. Richard J., R3. Prior complaints filed and buried by HR. Tasha Malcolm responded instantly. Noted. Continue monitoring all channels. From the galley. He saw Marissa Clark glance at him again. She leaned toward Ethan, whispering. He stiffened, looked toward Malcolm, and quickly looked away. They were nervous. Good. They should be. Warren Tully, now several drinks in, raised his voice in casual conversation with another older white man nearby. "Flying isn't what it used to be," he said. "Loud enough to carry? They let anyone up front these days. Scrape together some points, and voila, first class." His seatmate chuckled. "Standards have changed. Back in my day, clientele had quality, thinly veiled, barely hidden, and still, everyone around them pretended not to hear." Sophie Lang's lips curled in disgust. Malcolm Reed didn't flinch. He returned to his tablet, reviewing slides for tomorrow's merger announcement. He wasn't tuning them out, he was cataloging, watching, waiting. The plane began its descent into Chicago, engines shifting as altitude dropped. It was almost time. He reached into the seat pocket and retrieved his tablet, while passengers around him buckled in and stowed their belongings. Malcolm unlocked an unmarked app. Blue icon, white pulse line, no name. He entered a passcode, then a fingerprint scan. The app loaded instantly. StratusSync, a proprietary system created by Nova Flight Systems, his company, used to monitor in-flight operations, crew assignments, maintenance issues, and incident logs in real time. With a few silent taps, he accessed Flight NF742. The screen populated with rows of data, crew bios, cabin layout, behavioral analytics, Marissa Clark lead attendant, 3 guest complaints within the past year, all dismissed without investigation. Ethan Lowe clean on file, but new to the route. Probationary status, Captain Richard Nolan flagged twice for inappropriate conduct and once for hostile remarks during debriefs, all marked resolved with no follow-up. This wasn't just about one incident. It was systemic. He scrolled through the internal crew messaging logs. One message from Clark flagged by AI, keep him calm. Just smile. We'll deal with it later. Then another from Nolan himself. Should have pulled him before takeoff. Now it's a PR landmine. The lies weren't just whispered. They were typed. And they were time-stamped. Every prejudice, every slur, every slight. all recorded, all traceable. And by the time they touched down, all actionable. Malcolm Reed's eyes sharpened as he sifted through the data displayed on his tablet. Two names stood out in bold: Marissa Clark, lead flight attendant, and Captain Richard Nolan, the man in the cockpit. What he found under each profile was worse than he had expected and confirmed what he had suspected all along. Marissa Clark had 3 formal complaints filed against her in the past year, all submitted by passengers of color, all neatly dismissed as misunderstandings or insufficient evidence. One of them had even included video footage still marked inconclusive by an internal review board. Captain Nolan's record was just as unsettling. 2 documented instances of refusing to address female first officers by their titles. A report from a crew member about inappropriate remarks made toward a Muslim passenger, and a formal reprimand for unprofessional interactions with ground staff of color. None of these resulted in disciplinary action. Each incident had quietly disappeared under the weight of corporate protectionism. This wasn't a personnel problem. It was institutional. 4 months ago, Malcolm had sat silently through a meeting in a boardroom lined with glass and optimism. He had been invited as a hidden observer known only to the CEO and a few top executives during the early stages of Nova Flight Systems acquisition talks. At the time, the airline's head of HR had spoken proudly of their industry-leading diversity efforts. Malcolm had been skeptical then. Now, he had proof. The systemic rot went deeper than anyone had publicly acknowledged. A small notification popped up on his screen, a live cabin feed from the aircraft's internal cameras. The system, only accessible to those with the highest level of clearance, was something Malcolm had helped design himself. Through the feed, he watched Marissa Clark whisper to Ethan Lowe in the galley. Her posture was tense, defensive. Ethan nodded hesitantly, avoiding direct eye contact with her as she threw another glance toward Malcolm's seat. He checked the timestamp. Every moment was being logged. A soft chime echoed through the cabin. The seatbelt sign illuminated. Stratasync alerted him seconds before the announcement. A pocket of turbulence had formed just ahead. The plane shuddered lightly. Marissa began walking the aisle, ensuring passengers were buckled in. When she reached Malcolm, her voice sharpened like a blade. "Seatbelt! Now!" she snapped, loud enough for the surrounding rows to hear. Her tone was harsh, stripped of professionalism, the way one might speak to a stubborn child. Malcolm held her gaze, unflinching, then clicked his belt into place. "Thank you for the reminder," he said evenly. She moved on without response. He activated his phone's voice recorder, discreet but thorough. Every moment was being captured, not just in memory, but in a growing archive of truth. The turbulence rocked the aircraft gently. Across the cabin, Warren Tully, now thoroughly marinated in 3 rounds of scotch, raised a hand. Ethan Lowe approached. "Another drink?" "My good man," Tully boomed, slurring just slightly. Then, louder, "And tell me, what's the deal with our friend over there?" He gestured toward Malcolm. "Doesn't quite fit the usual profile." "Does he?" Ethan paused, visibly uncomfortable. "I'm sorry, sir. We're suspending beverage service during turbulence. Captain's orders." Tully waved a hand lazily. Sure. But come on. You gotta admit it's odd. Probably got those miles through a company program. Diversity hires getting all the perks these days." His words sliced through the cabin. From the galley, Marissa's chuckle floated through the air. Not loud, but unmistakable. Sophie Lang, quiet until now, straightened in her seat. "That's disgusting," she said, her voice firm. "Do you even hear yourself?" Tully turned, caught off guard. "Just making conversation. Young lady, No need to get emotional. It's not conversation when you're making racist assumptions. Sophie snapped. It's bigotry, and it's pathetic. Marissa Clark emerged from the galley. Irritation etched across her features. Miss, I'm going to ask you to lower your voice, she said tightly. We need to maintain a calm environment. Sophie's eyebrows lifted. Oh, I see. His comments are fine. But my objection is the problem. You can't police how people feel, Marissa replied coolly. Malcolm Reed, silent until now, finally spoke. His voice was calm but carried authority, a quiet current that cut through the tension. Actually, Quant, he said, discrimination violates FAA regulation 14 CFR paragraph 382. The air seemed to still. It prohibits discrimination based on race, religion, national origin, gender, or ancestry, he continued, and those protections extend to both airline employees and passengers. The entire cabin was silent. Marissa stared at him, her face reddening. You think quoting codes makes you right? Malcolm offered a quiet smile. No, he said, but the person who helped write those codes, that would be me. The impact hit like turbulence without warning. Marissa Clark's expression shifted from irritation to confusion, then realization. A flicker of recognition bloomed behind her eyes, and panic followed close behind. Ethan Lowe, still nearby, looked from Malcolm to Marissa, clearly rattled. Across the aisle, Sophie's lips parted in surprise, her journalist instincts firing like sparks. Warren Tully, who had dismissed Malcolm not half an hour ago, now looked at him with wary uncertainty. The scotch in his hand no longer offered any comfort. Outside the windows, the lights of Chicago shimmered against the encroaching dusk. Inside the cabin, another kind of light had flickered on the light of recognition. That power doesn't always come with a loud voice or a tailored suit. Sometimes it arrives in sneakers and silence. Marissa stormed to the galley, her steps rigid. Malcolm watched through the curtain gap as she grabbed a company-issued tablet and began frantically typing. He knew exactly what she was doing. Searching the internal personnel database, he could count it down. 3, 2, 1. Her face drained of color. There it was, Malcolm Reed, CEO of Nova Flight Systems, the company finalizing a merger with her employer, the airline she thought she understood. He watched the realization wash over her, saw her jaw tighten, her shoulders square as she tried to maintain control. But the shift had already begun. Tomorrow, the press would receive a story about inclusivity, innovation, and corporate transformation. What they didn't know yet was that the true headline had already been written midair, above the clouds, with a plate of dry bread and a glass of water. And the author was sitting in Tua. A week ago, there had been a company-wide memo. Most employees skimmed it, brushing past the boilerplate about Nova Flight Systems requesting discrete quality assurance measures during the merger process. Few gave it more than a passing thought. But now, as the plane began its descent toward O'Hare, Marissa Clark finally understood. Malcolm Reed hadn't been just a difficult passenger. He was the audit. The passenger in 2A was the reason she'd been under scrutiny this entire flight, though she hadn't known it. He was the one calling the shots behind the pending merger. And everything she thought had been harmless attitude or routine hierarchy enforcement now looked very different in the glaring light of consequence. She leaned close to Ethan Lowe, panic in her voice. That man is Malcolm Reed, she whispered, CEO of Nova Flight. He's about to own half the airline. Ethan went pale. His eyes flicked toward 2A, and suddenly his earlier complicity turned to dread. Around the cabin, the shift in energy was instant. Flight attendants who had previously avoided eye contact with Malcolm now scrambled to correct their posture, soften their voices, and offer comforts they should have provided hours ago. But the damage was done. When Marissa Clark returned to Malcolm's row, her voice had taken on an unnaturally high, sweet tone. "Mr. Reed, may I offer you champagne or anything you need?" He looked up at her with calm, unreadable eyes. "There's no need to perform now," he said evenly. "What's done is done." A few seats up, Warren Tully, who had spent the flight tossing around microaggressions and whiskey-drenched opinions, perked up. "Reed Waitier, Malcolm Reed." His tone flipped instantly, eager and gleaming. "The tech guy, Nova Flight. I've heard of you might have some mutuals in finance." He extended a hand, all smiles and unearned familiarity. Malcolm looked at it for a long beat, then looked away. Warren Tully's hand hovered in midair before he quietly retracted it, swallowing the silence like a bitter pill. Meanwhile, in the cockpit, Captain Richard Nolan was reading the same message that had shattered Marissa's composure. PSGR-2A is M. Reed, CEO, Nova Flight. Merger principal. Situation critical. He cursed under his breath. We should have pulled him from this flight. His co-pilot, Thomas Parker, glanced over. Who is he? The man about to own our company, Nolan muttered, and apparently Clark gave him the bread and water service. Parker's face went pale. You're kidding. I wish I was. They said nothing more. The cockpit filled with the low hum of engines and rising tension. Back in the cabin, Malcolm's phone buzzed. Harper pulled the full security feed. It's worse than expected. Repeated violations. Legal is preparing a full dossier. He typed back Malcolm compile and forward to legal plus PR. Across the aisle. Sophie Lang leaned in again. I'm a journalist, she said softly. With the Post. Would you be willing to speak on record about what happened? Malcolm studied her. Thoughtful. Not yet, he said finally. Let them keep digging. Sophie nodded, understanding the strategy. Let them bury themselves before handing them the shovel. Around them, flight attendants scurried. Suddenly, Malcolm was offered warm towels, better snacks, extra pillows. Marissa returned twice in 10 minutes, each time more desperate to reset the narrative. Her hands shook as she placed a crystal glass of water on his tray table, ice clinking loudly. The same woman who had smirked while giving him dry bread now hovered nervously, unable to make eye contact. The balance of power had tilted, and everyone could feel it. Even the passengers had changed. Where there were once sidelong glances of judgment, there were now furtive stares of curiosity or thinly veiled panic. People whispered, shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The first-class hierarchy had shattered in a matter of moments. And then, another alert. A video had gone viral. A passenger had captured Marissa Clark's now infamous remark, "This meal fits you." The video had been shared on multiple platforms. A hashtag was trending, bread and water flights. Marissa, growing desperate, returned once more. Her voice was tight with panic. Mr. Reed, I didn't know who you were. Malcolm didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to, and that's the problem. He said, just 6 words, but they landed like a gavel, and there was nothing she could say to dispute them. The truth of it settled heavily in the air between them. Her excuses, her frantic backpedaling, her sudden hospitality, it all meant nothing. The way she had treated him would have been wrong regardless of his name, his title, or his bank account, and now it was public and permanent. Marissa Clark rushed back to the galley. Her hands trembled as she yanked her crew-issued tablet from the charging dock. She pulled up the company database and typed the name with shaking fingers. Malcolm Reed. The profile loaded instantly. CEO Nova Flight Systems. Executive Oversight of Customer Experience Initiatives. Post-merger lead designer of Anonymous Quality Audit Program, estimated net worth $2.3 billion. Her breath caught. She covered her mouth. "Oh my God," she whispered. Every moment of this flight replayed in her mind. The cold greetings, the dry bread, the mocking comment, the ignored requests. All of it now sat against a backdrop of corporate horror. Ethan Lowe peeked in. "You okay?" "You look like you've seen a ghost." She turned the tablet around wordlessly. He read. His mouth opened. "We're done," he said hoarsely. "Completely done." "He can't prove anything," Marissa said quickly, a desperate edge creeping into her voice. "It's his word against ours." Ethan looked at her like she was a child. "He's the CEO of a tech company," he said. "What do you think he's been doing this entire flight?" The last 20 minutes of the journey passed in relative silence, the kind of silence that follows a detonation. No more drinks, no more whispers, just the slow, dawning understanding that nothing would ever go back to the way it was. Malcolm looked out the window as the city lights of Chicago came into view, his reflection faint in the glass. He thought of Sophie's question. He thought of his daughter's words that morning. Better yes. Yes, it would be, but only because he had chosen not just to endure the flight, but to document it, to let the rot surface, to let the guilty make their own choices, expose their own hearts. By the time the wheels touched down at O'Hare, the world already knew what had happened at 30,000 feet. And tomorrow, the airline would know what it felt like to be held accountable. "You think he doesn't have evidence?" Ethan Lowe's voice dropped to a panicked whisper. "This cabin has cameras. For all we know, everything we've said is already with his team." The words hit Marissa Clark like a gust of cold wind. She knew what Nova Flight Systems specialized in. She'd heard it in onboarding training, seen it on tech briefs. Security systems, cabin monitoring, real-time analytics. If anyone could access in-flight data covertly, it was Malcolm Reed. Her knees felt weak. "I have to fix this," she mumbled, smoothing down her uniform, lipstick trembling as she reapplied it with a shaky hand. "It's too late," Ethan said, quietly but firmly. He's already made up his mind. But Marissa was already moving, grabbing a silver tray and placing a single flute of champagne on it like an offering at an altar. When she reached Malcolm's seat, her smile was overbright forced, thin. "Mr. Reed," she said in her best polished tone, "we'd like to offer you our finest champagne." Malcolm looked up slowly from his tablet. His expression was unreadable. "No need for theatrics now," he said calmly, brushing away the offer with a flick of his fingers. "What's done is done." His voice was even, but the weight of it made Marissa flinch. Across the aisle, Warren Tully perked up, his earlier arrogance melting into a smile full of sudden recognition. "Wait, you're that Malcolm Reed." His voice cracked slightly. The one behind the Miller acquisition last year. Malcolm didn't reply. Just let the silence stretch. "I'm Warren Tully, Eastland Banking," he said quickly, leaning forward, extending a hand across the aisle. "I believe we have mutuals in the financial sector. Wilson at Goldman mentioned your name just last week." Malcolm looked at the hand but didn't move. After an awkward beat, Tully withdrew it, rubbing his palm against his pants like the contact had burned him anyway. Meanwhile, in the cockpit, Captain Richard Nolan read the urgent notification sent by the head flight attendant. Passenger 2A, Brasser Malcolm Reed, CEO Nova Flight. Involved in merger. Incident reported. Critical alert. The lines on Nolan's face deepened. Should have had him removed from the flight, he muttered to co-pilot Frank Wilson. Who is he? Wilson asked, glancing up from the controls. The man who's about to own half the airline, Nolan said grimly, and apparently Clark served him the dry bread and water, special. Wilson blinked. That was him. He exhaled sharply. Who the hell assigned this flight? Nolan didn't answer. His mind was already spiraling into damage control mode. Maybe a personal apology, he murmured. These types respond to a sincere approach. Wilson didn't look convinced. Back in the cabin, Malcolm's phone buzzed again. A message from Jordan Myers, his assistant. Just pulled full footage. Multiple violations confirmed. Discriminatory patterns evident. Legal assembling briefing. Malcolm typed back, compile. Send to Legal Plus. PR. Do not release yet. As he slipped the phone into his pocket, Sophie Lang leaned in from across the aisle. I'm a journalist, she said quietly. The Post. Would you be willing to speak on record about this? Malcolm paused, taking in the quiet intelligence in her eyes. Not yet, he said. Let them dig a little deeper. She nodded, a professional's patience in her gaze. When you're ready, I'll help tell it right. Around them. The cabin buzzed with subtle but frantic energy. Flight attendants who had previously ignored Malcolm were now appearing like clockwork, offering premium snacks, expensive pillows, warm towels. He declined each one. People watched him not with disdain, but with growing curiosity, and in many cases, fear. Marissa Clark returned again. Her makeup was slightly smeared despite a hurried attempt to fix it. Her hands clasped tightly in front of her. Mr. Reed, she said softly. I didn't know who you were. He looked at her with quiet clarity. And that's the problem, he replied. She opened her mouth, but nothing came out. She turned, defeated, and retreated to the galley. On his tablet, a new notification blinked. A passenger video capturing Marissa's now infamous line. This meal fits you. Already. It had been reposted across several platforms. The hashtag #DallasFlyingWhileBlack was trending, drawing personal accounts from hundreds of other passengers nationwide. And the PR disaster was only beginning. Jordan Myers sent another message. Internal security accessed Nolan's comms. He plans to approach with a personal apology after landing. Legal recommends no private engagement. Malcolm nodded to himself. Every step had to be measured now. Every word part of the record. The cabin intercom crackled as Captain Nolan addressed the passengers. Ladies and gentlemen, we're beginning our descent into O'Hare International Airport. Skies are clear, with a local temperature of 65 degrees. We'll be on the ground in approximately 20 minutes. On behalf of our entire crew, thank you for choosing our airline. The voice was smoother than before. Friendly, contrived. Passengers shuffled their belongings, raised their seats, closed trays. Sophie Lang leaned across the aisle. You knew this would happen, didn't you? She asked. This flight wasn't random. Malcolm didn't answer immediately. He looked out the window at the deep orange skyline of downtown Chicago, glowing in the distance. Let's just say I wanted to see the truth before signing off on anything. And she asked gently. He turned back toward the tray in front of him. The bread and the untouched cup of water sat exactly where they'd been placed. He gestured toward them. Exactly what I expected, he said. A culture problem, one that starts at the top. His phone vibrated one last time before landing. Security in place at O'Hare. Legal and PR standing by. Proceed. Malcolm stared at the screen for a long moment, then typed, "Wait for my word. I want to see how deep it goes." The wheels lowered. The flaps extended. Through the window, the runways grew closer. He buckled his seatbelt and folded his hands over his lap. Tomorrow, he would be in a boardroom on the 52nd floor of a tower he now controlled, finalizing a merger that would send shockwaves through the aviation industry. But today, he was a black man served dry bread in silence. And now, the world was watching. But first, there was unfinished business. Marissa Clark approached once more, her earlier arrogance now wholly replaced with visible panic. She leaned a little too close, her voice soft, rehearsed in the mirror of the galley. "Mr. Reed, would you like a proper meal before we land?" she asked. "Our chef can prepare something special while we taxi to the gate." Malcolm looked up from his tablet. Cool and resolute. "I already ate," he said. He paused, then added quietly, "Your true colors?" The words didn't rise above a whisper, but they struck like a thunderclap. Marissa flinched as if slapped, her last shred of hope for redemption withering on the spot. She nodded once and turned away, the choreography of her retreat mechanical. Malcolm's phone vibrated. Another message from Jordan Myers Legal is prepped. PR holding the story until touchdown. Fire them on contact. He stared at the screen for a moment. The fast answer was obvious clean house. But this wasn't just about punishing individuals. This was about exposure, a system, a signal to an industry. "Wait for my word. I want to handle this personally." Jordan replied immediately. "Car is at the private terminal. Media is circling." Across the aisle, Sophie Lang angled her phone discreetly toward him. The screen showed the moments that had led them here dry bread. Mocking service, a name tag zoomed in frame. "I've been recording most of it," she said in a hushed tone. "If you go public, I want to help shape the story. This isn't just a rogue attendant. It's culture, and it's rot." Malcolm nodded. "Back it up. Prepare a release draft," he said, "but hold until I say so." Sophie gave a single confirming nod, just as Marissa passed again, now avoiding both their eyes entirely. Then came Ethan Lowe, the junior flight attendant, his face drawn and sincere. He stopped beside Malcolm's seat, clutching the corner of the seat back like a life raft. "Mr. Reed," he began, his voice tight. "I need to apologize. I saw what was happening, and I didn't do anything. I should have." His shame was real, raw. Malcolm looked him over. "You still have time," he said. "The right moment's coming." Ethan nodded slowly. A decision settled in his eyes like a stone, skipping its last bounce. He understood. In the cockpit, Captain Nolan spoke into the crew intercom. "Keep it professional," he barked. "We've got a storm coming. The second we hit the ground. Clark, no talking to Reed. Wilson, same. I'll handle it on the tarmac." Marissa's voice returned, brittle with nerves. "We'll keep him happy until then." "Too late for that," Nolan said flatly. "Just don't make it worse, and wipe anything questionable from the service log." What Nolan didn't realize was that every word was being streamed directly to Nova Flight Systems' secure servers. Months ago, during early merger testing, Malcolm's company had integrated a proprietary system into every aircraft in the fleet. And this one was live. Through the haze of descending clouds, Malcolm received another notification. "Jordan again. News chatter has started. Racial incident on an airline trending. No airline named yet, but it's heating up. In the galley. Marissa pulled Ethan aside, her face flushed, frantic. "Delete anything in the service log that could hurt us," she whispered harshly. "The food, the comments, the seat dispute. All of it." Ethan looked torn. "That's tampering. It'll look like a cover-up." "It's already worse than that," she snapped. "Just do it." But as soon as Marissa turned her back, Ethan pulled out his phone and forwarded the unedited service log to an address that only one person had authorized Jordan Myers. Not long after, the cabin rumbled as the landing gear extended beneath them, the familiar thunk reverberating like a judge's gavel. Outside, the sprawl of Chicago twinkled beneath them, rivers of headlights and flickering windows. Inside the plane, Marissa made one final bid to salvage her reputation. She emerged from the galley cradling a delicate china plate chocolate mousse, artfully decorated with edible gold leaf, normally reserved for VIPs. She set it down on Malcolm's tray with trembling fingers. "Just a small gesture," she offered, voice hushed. Malcolm glanced at the dessert, then back at her. "What you gave me before," he said, motioning to the untouched bread and water. "That was symbolic." He held her gaze. "Now it's permanent." There was no malice in his tone, but its clarity, its truth, was devastating. Marissa stood still for a second too long, then backed away, plate in hand, as if afraid to leave it behind. The cabin lights dimmed. Over the intercom, Captain Nolan's voice broke the silence. "Flight crew, prepare for landing." Malcolm sat back, straightened his blazer, and adjusted his tie. His reflection in the darkened window met his eyes calm, unflinching, immovable. He leaned slightly toward Sophie. "Let's bring this plane to justice." Sophie smiled faintly. "I'm ready when you are." The tires met the tarmac with a smooth screech. Reverse thrust slowed the aircraft as they taxied toward Gate 37. Another vibration in Malcolm's pocket. SUVs are waiting at the terminal. Private route secured. Media's already outside. Someone leaked it. He typed back, "Proceed as planned. I'll handle the crew myself." Through the window, a line of black SUVs appeared beside the terminal, engines humming. Inside, a different kind of engine had just been switched on, and it was one no one could stop. Airport security was already in position when the aircraft taxied to a stop at O'Hare International Airport. Their stance was relaxed, but the message was clear. Control had shifted. Captain Richard Nolan's voice came over the intercom, final and formal. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Chicago O'Hare International Airport. Local time is 8:47 p.m. and the temperature is 64 degrees. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened until the aircraft comes to a complete stop." A beat of silence. Then the captain's voice returned with a practiced warmth that rang hollow to everyone who had witnessed what had unfolded in first class. "On behalf of our entire crew, thank you for choosing to fly with us today. We hope your experience was a pleasant one." Several passengers glanced sideways. A few even scoffed softly. Sophie Lang let out a short, incredulous laugh, covering it with a cough. As the seatbelt sign dinged off and passengers stood to retrieve bags, Malcolm Reed remained seated. His body was calm, composed, but his mind was sharply alert, every sense tuned in to what was about to happen. At the front of the plane, Marissa Clark stood by the galley, hands clasped tightly, her shoulders unnaturally stiff. Halfway down the aisle, Ethan Lowe lingered, glancing nervously toward Malcolm. From where he sat, Malcolm could see the cockpit door open. Captain Nolan stepped out, His posture was rigid, his face drawn. Their eyes met. For a flicker of a second, Nolan's mask cracked, his narrowed gaze a mixture of challenge and recognition before he looked away, adjusting his cap with a clenched jaw. As the jet bridge connected, Marissa made her final, desperate move. She scribbled a quick note on a napkin and approached Malcolm, sliding it onto his tray table with trembling fingers. "I didn't mean to offend you," it read. "Please understand, it was a misunderstanding." Malcolm picked up the napkin, read it in silence, then handed it back without expression. "Intent doesn't erase impact," he said. 4 words, no anger, just undeniable truth. Marissa stood still, stricken. There was no rebuttal, no rehearsed explanation that would matter anymore. The cabin door opened. Instead of a gate agent, 2 uniformed airport security officers stepped inside. They were followed by Vanessa Mitchell, head of security for Nova Flight Systems, sharp in a tailored Navy suit. "Mr. Reed," she greeted, voice crisp. "Your car is ready." "Thank you, Vanessa," Malcolm replied, rising slowly and collecting his briefcase. He turned to Sophie. "You'll want to come with us." "Ms. Lang," she said. "Sophie Lang. And yes, I would." Vanessa turned to the officers. "Please escort Captain Richard Nolan, Flight Attendant Marissa Clark, and Flight Attendant Ethan Lowe to the executive debriefing room." Nolan's nostrils flared. "I have post-flight duties to perform." "Your co-pilot will handle them," Vanessa interrupted evenly. "This takes priority." One of the security officers stepped closer. "No threats, just procedure." But Nolan understood the implication. He exhaled hard, muttered, "Fine," and stepped forward. Marissa followed, her movements robotic. Ethan trailed behind, resigned, but oddly lighter, like someone finally telling the truth after holding it in too long. Passengers whispered as Malcolm walked to the front of the cabin. First-class eyes tracked his every move. Something important had happened. That much was clear. He paused before stepping off, glancing back and go. The slice of dry bread and plastic cup of water still sat untouched on his tray. Evidence, symbol, catalyst. On the jet bridge, Jordan Myers stood waiting with a tablet. "Everything's in motion," she said in a low voice as they walked. "Execs are in the conference room. Legal's assembled. PR has 3 response options, ready scalable, depending on how far you want to go." Malcolm nodded. "Documentation." "All of it," she confirmed. "Live footage, service logs, audio, internal comms. It's airtight." As they passed through a private corridor, avoiding the camera crews swarming the main exits, Jordan added, "Media's already buzzing. They haven't named the airline yet, but it won't take long." They reached a security checkpoint. Beyond it, a conference room filled with executives from both airlines sat waiting, some pale, others flushed. 3 crew members at the center of the scandal were already seated separately, not yet spoken to, but visibly unnerved. Malcolm stood outside the door for a beat. "Are you ready?" Jordan asked quietly. He adjusted his tie. "I've been ready my whole life." The door opened. Inside the room, air seemed to thicken the moment Malcolm Reed entered. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. Coffee cups were set down, untouched. The air held a quiet tension, the kind before a storm. Marissa Clark sat rigid, eyes flicking toward Malcolm, then back to the table. Ethan Lowe offered a small, apologetic nod. Captain Nolan sat furiously upright, his jaw grinding. At the head of the table, Malcolm placed his briefcase down, opened it slowly, and pulled out a single item, the folded napkin with Marissa's handwritten note. He said it in front of her. "This is what you thought would undo it?" he asked, not unkindly, but firmly. No one answered. He turned his gaze to the execs. "You told me months ago that this airline had no cultural blind spots, that it led the industry in inclusivity, that no reform was necessary. What happened today says otherwise." He gestured toward Marissa, Nolan, and Ethan. They weren't anomalies. They were products of the culture you claimed didn't exist. No one interrupted. He let the silence linger before continuing. "The technology my company created monitors more than flight paths and mechanical systems. It watches human behavior, too. Every slight, every moment, every assumption, and every word." He tapped the tablet screen once. A clip began playing Marissa's mocking delivery of the bread and water, her sarcastic tone, passengers shifting uncomfortably in their seats, the tension, the weight. Silence in the room turned brittle. "I'm not here for revenge," Malcolm said. "I'm here for accountability." Then he turned to the 3 crew members. "To you, Captain Nolan," he said, "your record was already questionable. I now have a complete transmission of your post-landing attempt to erase internal logs. That alone disqualifies you from further leadership. To Ethan," he nodded, "you made a choice tonight. You told the truth. You forwarded the full, unedited log when someone else asked you to delete it. That matters. To Marissa," he paused, "you had every chance to course correct. You chose not to. And now, there are consequences." He turned to the CEO of the airline, silent until now, face pale. "I'll leave the final disciplinary decisions to you, for now, then to everyone else in the room. But the culture changes now, or we walk away from this merger and take our capital, our technology, and our trust with us." The gravity in his tone echoed. A decision point. Outside, the media lights glowed hotter. Rumors buzzed. A quiet reckoning was unfolding behind the private glass walls of a terminal conference room. But the world would know soon. The plane had landed, but for an industry, the descent was just beginning. We're not just merging companies. We're transforming a culture. The words lingered in the air as Malcolm Reed addressed the boardroom filled with stunned airline executives. Each executive now held a tablet loaded with new policy mandates, drafted over the past 4 months by Nova Flight Systems and Malcolm's legal team contingencies built for a moment just like this. Across the table, Richard Barton, the airline CEO, looked more rattled than defiant. "What kind of modifications are we talking about?" he asked, voice tight. Malcolm didn't flinch. Mandatory anti-bias and ethics training for all employees. Monthly audits, including anonymous crew evaluations. Independent grievance reviews. And every plane in your fleet gets upgraded with Nova Flight's full monitoring suite, including behavioral logging. One executive protested weakly, "That's a huge operational cost." Malcolm turned to him. "Not as costly as another national headline." No one challenged that. He continued, walking slowly around the room like a prosecutor delivering closing arguments. "You told the world you were a leader in equity. But that promise can't be cosmetic. It has to be enforced at every gate, in every crew briefing, in every interaction. Because if it's not, you're not just failing your customers, you're enabling harm." He paused at the head of the table. Today, that harm had a camera. Tomorrow, it could be a lawsuit. Silence. Across the room, Sophie Lang, the journalist, quietly observed, her notebook open but untouched. She already had the full story, but like Malcolm, she knew timing mattered. After a long moment, Barton sighed. "You'll have everything you need." "You'll have what the passengers need," Malcolm corrected. He turned toward Jordan Myers. who handed out a final document. The top of the page read, "Culture Mandate Terms of Accountability for the Future of Aviation." "Each of you signs this," Malcolm said, "or the merger halts, and I walk." The weight of that statement pressed into the air. Billion-dollar negotiations balanced on a single line of ink. One by one, the executives signed. Outside the boardroom, a controlled press area had been arranged. Behind the frosted doors, the hum of media crews grew louder. Word had leaked a scandal mid-flight, a CEO with a camera, and a high-stakes corporate reckoning. Sophie approached Malcolm as he reviewed a live feed of the press zone. "They're ready for a statement," she said. "You sure you want to do this personally?" Malcolm nodded. "They need to hear it from the one who lived it." Jordan joined him. "You've got 2 pre-approved statements from PR, or you can go off script." He glanced down at his phone. Over 2 million views now. Hashtags like Power Bread and Water Flight, Flying While Black, and Our Accountability, Altitude were trending globally. "No script," he said. "Just truth." Minutes later, the doors to the media suite opened. The flashes began immediately. Malcolm Reed stepped up to the podium, no notes, no teleprompter, no legal handler whispering in his ear. He spoke directly, clearly. "My name is Malcolm Reed. I am the CEO of Nova Flight Systems and, as of today, a principal stakeholder in this airline. Yesterday, I was a first-class passenger on Flight 298 from San Francisco to Chicago. I boarded like any other traveler with a ticket, a seat, and expectations of dignity." He paused, letting the cameras settle. "Instead, I received a slice of dry bread and a cup of water. Not because of a supply issue, not because of airline policy, but because of assumptions, because of bias, because of a system that has gone unchecked for too long." He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. What happened wasn't just about me. It was about every person who's been dismissed, ignored, or humiliated for how they look, where they come from, or what someone thinks they can afford. Cameras clicked rapidly. And today, right now, we are beginning a course correction. He outlined the new measures training, surveillance transparency, accountability systems, and a public oversight task force. Every change would be made visible. Every metric would be trackable. "This isn't cancel culture," he concluded. "This is consequence culture, and it's long overdue." After the conference, as the press mob thinned and the last questions died down, Sophie Lang caught up with Malcolm in the private lounge. "You realize you just turned a business deal into a movement," she said, eyes sharp. "Maybe," Malcolm replied, pulling out his phone and scrolling through messages of support flooding in from across the country. "But I didn't do it alone." In the days that followed, consequences rippled outward. Marissa Clark, Captain Nolan, and others named in the investigation were permanently barred from working with any airline under federal regulation. Ethan Lowe, surprisingly, became a key consultant in Nova Flight's new ethics program. Sophie Lang's feature article, titled "Bread, Water, and the Cost of Silence," went viral and was syndicated nationally. And Malcolm. He didn't just finalize the merger, he redefined what a merger meant. Epilogue. 1 week later, back in his suburban home, Malcolm Reed tucked his daughter into bed. "Did you change the airline?" she asked, her small voice muffled against his chest. "I think we started to," he said, smoothing her curls. Because of the bread, he smiled. "No, baby, because of what it stood for." She nodded solemnly, then grinned. "Next time, maybe they'll bring cookies." He chuckled, kissed her forehead, and turned off the light. As he stood in the doorway, He looked down at his phone one last time. An email had just arrived. Subject: FAA Board Requests. Meeting on National Inclusion Framework. He smiled. This wasn't the end of the story. It was only the beginning. These contain the new conditions, Malcolm Reed said, sliding the contract across the polished conference table. You'll find them non-negotiable. The silence that followed was heavy. Around him, airline executives scanned the digital tablets, eyes widening as they absorbed the terms mandatory anti-bias training, an independent oversight board, anonymous evaluations, and real penalties for misconduct. No fine print, no loopholes, just change written plainly, enforced clearly. Richard Barton cleared his throat. This is extensive. Malcolm met his eyes. So was the problem. He leaned back slightly, calm and unmoving. You can sign today, or we walk away. Your choice. At the far side of the room, Sophie Lang stepped beside Malcolm, her voice low. That was impressive, she murmured. But what happens when the story fades? When the hashtags stop trending? Malcolm offered a quiet smile. That's where you come in. We don't just tell this story. We change the story. Sophie nodded slowly, the weight of his words sinking in. I can help with that. Outside the boardroom, Jordan Meyer's phone buzzed. She glanced at it, then turned the screen toward Malcolm. Joke Bread is Not service was trending worldwide. Thousands of people were posting their own stories of discrimination while flying. The single tray of dry bread and a plastic cup of water had become a symbol and an indictment of bias at 35,000 feet. It wasn't just a scandal anymore. It was a movement. 24 hours later, Malcolm stood at a press podium inside a Manhattan hotel, flanked by Sophie Lang and Jordan. The room was packed. Dozens of reporters, industry regulators, civil rights advocates, cameras from every major network. Malcolm looked into the sea of lenses and said yesterday, I wasn't just denied a meal. I was denied dignity, and I wasn't alone. He let the silence hold for a moment, then continued. This isn't about bread and water. It's about a system, a culture that decides who is worthy of respect based not on behavior, but on bias. The cameras flashed rapidly. It ends now. He laid out sweeping reforms that would be implemented across the airline immediately. Anonymous flight evaluations delivered directly to top leadership. Real-time cabin monitoring logged to independent review systems. A Sky Equity Division, dedicated solely to passenger fairness. Training from people who had lived the discrimination, just read about it in binders. Then, Malcolm stepped aside, and a surprising figure walked on stage. Ethan Lowe. Gone was the timid flight attendant who once looked away. In his place stood a man ready to confront his complicity. I was there, Ethan said. I saw what was happening, and I didn't stop it. He paused, then straightened his back. But now I'm here to make sure it never happens again. Ethan had accepted a new role as a training supervisor in the Sky Equity Division. His words resonated with the audience, a testament that redemption is possible, but only through truth and action. When reporters asked about Marissa Clark and Captain Richard Nolan, Malcolm's answer was clear. They've been terminated. Their cases are now with federal transportation authorities. He said nothing more, but he didn't have to. The media had already unearthed a history of similar complaints. Their names had become cautionary tales, not just within the airline, but across the industry. That evening, Malcolm returned to what mattered most. A classroom of black and brown students at a STEM charter school in Brooklyn. No podium, no microphones, just him, sitting casually on a stool, rolling up his sleeves. A girl in the front row raised her hand. Did you change the airline? Malcolm smiled softly. We started to. She frowned. Because they gave you bread and water. He leaned in. No, he said, because they thought I wouldn't fight back. The students leaned forward, hanging on his words. Don't ever let the seat you're in decide what kind of person you are, Malcolm said. Whether it's row 36 in coach or seat 1A in first class, you deserve respect. And if someone tries to take that from you, you stand up, even if you're sitting down, outside. The sun dipped below the city skyline. The viral story of the flight that changed everything was still echoing through newsrooms, boardrooms, and dinner tables. But for Malcolm Reed, this wasn't just about policy. It was personal. And the journey for equity, dignity, and lasting change had just taken off. A young girl in the front row raised her hand, her voice soft but clear. What if you do everything right, and they still treat you badly? Malcolm Reed paused, the question hitting deeper than most. He looked at the young face staring back at him, brave, honest, unshielded by age or cynicism. Then you document it, he said plainly. You find allies. You gather evidence. And when the time is right, you use whatever platform you have to make change, not just for yourself, but for everyone who comes after you. The internet erupted in agreement. The image of a slice of bread and a plastic cup of water, quietly snapped by multiple passengers, had become a powerful symbol. Bread is not service was now everywhere on morning talk shows, corporate policy slides, protest signs, and trending threads. People from across industries began sharing stories of being underestimated, overlooked, or outright mistreated. Airports, hotels, offices, restaurants, the places changed, but the pattern didn't. What had started on a single flight had grown into something far greater, a national conversation on dignity, equity, and respect. Sophie Lang's article, Discrimination at 40,000 Feet, was published in multiple outlets and praised for its thoughtful, layered narrative. It went beyond outrage digging into the structures that silently reward silence and punish empathy. She wrote about what happened, but more importantly, why it kept happening, and how people like Malcolm were choosing to challenge it loudly, publicly, and unapologetically. One quiet evening, a week after the merger announcement, Malcolm sat alone in his home office. A warm amber light filled the space, and Thelonious Monk played gently from his speakers. He scrolled through the final merger terms one last time, then picked up his phone and texted Jordan Myers. This was never about a meal. It was about a message. Jordan replied instantly, and you delivered it. Malcolm smiled faintly and leaned back, letting the jazz piano swell. The storm had passed, but the real rebuilding had just begun. Weeks later, Malcolm boarded a flight to London for a keynote on ethical tech. From the moment he stepped onto the plane, he felt it. The shift. The flight crew was professional, attentive, and diverse. Their welcome felt genuine, not performative, not forced, just respectful, standard, as it should have always been. "Good evening, sir," a flight attendant said, handing him the menu. "Would you like to look at our dinner options?" Malcolm accepted the menu with a nod. "Yes, thank you." There were no awkward pauses, no assumptions, no surveillance in disguise. Just service, just humanity. The changes he'd pushed through were already taking root. Anonymous in-flight audits, new training with lived experience educators, a zero-tolerance policy that wasn't just a memo but a mandate. It was working, quietly, steadily. It was working. As the jet ascended, Malcolm looked out the window at the world shrinking below. Cities, highways, Homes, every inch a place where people just wanted to feel seen, respected, safe. He wasn't done. There was still so much work to do. But for now, in this moment, Malcolm Reed could breathe. The industry had changed. The world was listening, and he had helped make that happen. He turned back to his tablet and opened the first slide of his presentation, Designing Systems for Human Dignity, the next era of ethical innovation. And then, as the clouds broke open and sunlight filled the cabin, he smiled. He was no longer just flying first class. He was flying with purpose. And this time, he wasn't flying alone. What began with a silent slight in first class ended as something much louder, a national call to action. Malcolm Reed could have walked off that plane in silence. He had the money, the power, the influence. But he chose something different. He chose to make the invisible visible. He chose to hold the system accountable. He chose to use his seat not for comfort, but for change. And change came. The airline's policies were rewritten. Employees were held responsible, not quietly fired, but publicly confronted. An entire Sky Equity division was created, not as a PR stunt, but as a watchdog for fairness. And most importantly, voices were heard. Passengers who had felt ignored, disrespected, or dismissed finally saw their own stories reflected in Malcolm's. What made this story powerful wasn't a billionaire's revenge. It was his restraint, his strategy, his refusal to let emotion override intention. Because true change isn't about rage. It's about resolve. From the bread and water to the boardroom. This was never just about service. It was about what we accept as normal and who gets to define that. As Malcolm said to the young girl in the classroom, you document it, you gather allies. And when the time is right, you make change not just for you, but for everyone who comes after you. That's not just advice. That's a blueprint. So whether you're in economy or first class, in a conference room or a classroom, know this. You deserve to be seen. You deserve to be heard. You deserve to be respected. Let this story remind us all dignity isn't a luxury. It's a right. If this story moved you, please like, share, and subscribe for more powerful narratives that inspire empathy, courage, and reflection. Because the flight may have landed, but the journey toward justice is only beginning. Thank you for watching. See you on the next story.